2 years ago, I was working in a very small coffee stand about 30 minutes outside of Seattle. I'd been working as a barista for 7 years by that point, and I had never been confronted with a situation that challenged my feeling of security while working alone. Unfortunately, that was all about to change. On Thursday, November 7th, I remember it was my birthday, and it was around 6:45 p.m. I was starting to close the stand like normal. It was very rare that I would ever have customers come through past 6:30, and because of this, I felt myself jump slightly when I looked up from the espresso machine I was cleaning to see a man standing behind the glass of the closed window. Adding to my alarm was the fact that this man had made no noise whatsoever and had not tried to grab my attention at all. Instead, he just stood there behind the window in complete silence, with his mouth awkwardly fixed into an unnatural-looking smile. At first, I wasn't even sure if he was a customer at all, considering the idea that he may have been a part of a large group of transients and homeless people who were known to reside in the area. They would occasionally come up to the stand and ask for some free coffee or water. For safety reasons, I would typically refrain from serving walk-up customers after dusk, but because I had made eye contact with him, the rules of good customer service required that I at least acknowledge the fact he was there. Reluctantly, I decided to serve him. He introduced himself as Ivan, and he looked to be around my age. He seemed reasonably well kept in the sense that his clothing and overall appearance looked clean. Despite an Eastern European accent, his English was also very good. His eyes, however, were utterly unnerving. Something about his gaze made my stomach feel uneasy. Immediately, my intuition was alarming me that something about this individual was very off. Every red flag was beginning to show in my mind, and I could not shake the deep and almost overwhelming sense of darkness I felt coming from this person. It was a strange feeling I couldn't ignore. I would soon find out exactly why I was feeling this way. After greeting him as politely as I could manage, despite my growing hesitations, I began to prepare my machine to make him a drink. However, he didn't seem to know what he wanted to order. I asked him twice what I could get started for him before I silently recognized the fact he was likely not here for the coffee. Eventually, he abandoned ordering altogether and instead directed our interaction towards some small talk. He asked me where I was from and how long I had been working at the stand. I answered each of his questions with short, abrupt answers, hoping my tone and clear lack of engagement would convey the fact I was not interested in continuing this conversation. Since he was not a paying customer and because I was about to close up, I asked him to leave. After a long pause, he asked me if I had a boyfriend. Annoyed, I snapped at him. No! At this point, I was ready to end our interaction. I told him to leave right now so I could go home as well. Upon hearing this, he walked away from the window and mentioned he was looking forward to seeing me again very soon. After a minute or so, he passed out of sight, but the creepy aura lingering in my gut told me he was not somewhere far away. I just knew he had to be watching me from somewhere just beyond my line of vision. Cautiously, I closed up the stand, locked the doors and windows, and walked out to my car. I drove home. By the following day, I'd forgotten all about the encounter. I went to work as usual, and nothing really out of the ordinary happened. At 7 p.m., once again, I was just about to end my shift and close the stand. I was nearly finished when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head toward the opposite side of the stand, and there, in full view of both me and the security cameras, stood the same guy from yesterday. He smiled at me with this predatory grin, waved, and then proceeded to pull open the closed window in front of him. Even though he was not presenting himself aggressively, there was something incredibly threatening about him choosing to do that. I cleared my throat and told him as firmly as possible that I was off the clock now and I would not be able to make anything for him. My machine had already been cleaned up and the register was closed out for the day. His smile widened. "It's okay. I didn't come here for the coffee anyway. I came here for you." Upon hearing this, I noticed a shift in the energy building. "I don't care what you came here for," I told him as sternly as I could manage. "It's going to have to wait till tomorrow, because I'm closed." His smile disappeared, and his eyes became even more focused on me. "I guess I'll see you tomorrow then." It felt less like a statement and more like a threat. I swallowed, and once he was out of sight, I rushed back to the window and slammed it down, throwing the lock in place again. Despite not being able to visually confirm his presence in the darkness outside, I knew he was still there somewhere. I could feel his eyes staring at me. I ran out and quickly got to my car and drove home. This time, however, he remained heavily on my mind for the rest of the night, robbing me of any sleep at all. The following morning was a Saturday, so as per usual, I got up insanely early for work at 5 a.m. I arrived at the stand 10 minutes to 5, and for the first few hours of my shift, everything was as it would normally be. 8:30 rolled around, and as I was admiring the weather outside, I noticed a familiar truck approaching. As it neared closer, I recognized it as my ex-boyfriend Jonathan. I found it exceptionally odd, as he and I were currently on not very friendly terms. He pulled up slowly to the edge of the open window, and I asked him what he was doing here. "I'm sure I'm probably not who you're wanting to see today, but I just wanted to come by and wish you a happy belated birthday, and see how you were doing." It was just as I was about to heartily thank him for the birthday wishes that I noticed someone about 100 yards away, approaching the stand on foot. It was Ivan. I whispered quickly to Jonathan that I needed him to stay there with me, even if another customer pulled in for service, until the guy who was walking up was gone. He agreed to stay. Just as Ivan approached, I walked slowly over to him and noticed right away he must have been crying. His eyes were bloodshot and tears streaked down his cheeks. Disregarding his emotional state, I informed him he needed to leave, as I was not going to serve him. Before my statement reached its conclusion, however, he cut off my words abruptly. "I don't need this anymore. You can have it," he said. He threw a Russian passport down on the counter in front of me. Puzzled, I picked it up. "Why don't you need this anymore?" "I just won't." I allowed his words to hang between us, while I attempted to make sense of what this gesture meant. I felt a strong bite of dread inside my chest. I understood what was about to happen here. No guests from a foreign country would be willing to discard or abandon their passport unless they intended to do something with absolute finality and were not planning on returning. Ivan's tears were now replaced with a look of what I could only describe as complete and utter insanity. This is the point where the dynamics of our interaction shifted completely. "God came to me last night in my dreams. He told me you would be my wife. You are my wife." He had a sickening, sadistic smile curled on the corners of his mouth. "You're my wife, and you're gonna come with me right now." He planted his hands firmly onto the ledge of the window and began to lift himself onto it. Realizing that he was attempting to crawl into the stand, I practically threw myself across the small distance between us. I slammed the window down, locking it as well. He pushed his weight back down off the edge and then proceeded to give me a look that made me truly understand the meaning of having one's blood run cold. He ran out of sight. Soon after, I could distinguish beeping of buttons being punched on a keypad, the one that secured the lock on the back door. Ivan was trying to get through that entrance. In my mind, I knew there was no way he could ever manage to guess the 4-number code. But it's not that easy to just dismiss things like that. What I heard next, though, is something I will never forget. I heard the fateful sound of the keypad indicating a successful entry code. followed by the loud and heavy thud of the steel deadbolt retreating. All I could see was the door in front of me, nothing else. It felt as if time had stopped. The door began to slowly push open from the outside, and I could hear a deafening scream resonate through the walls of the stand. I stood there completely paralyzed and bared witness to the largest knife I had ever seen, entering through the opening of the door first, followed by Ivan's hand firmly gripped around it. It was only then that I realized the scream I was hearing was my own. Ivan passed the remainder of his body through the opening of the back door and came inside the stand before I could do anything. Let me just say, unless you personally experience a situation that demands you access your fight or flight response, you have no idea what response that's going to be. A lot of people say they'll know what they'll do, but most people never realize how you'll react to it in the moment. It's involuntary. I suddenly remembered that Jonathan was still in his truck on the other side of the stand. I ran to the window and screamed through the glass to him for help. Jonathan's eyes grew huge, and he threw open his driver's side door. He ran out of his truck toward the back of the building. Then, in the corner of my vision, I could see Ivan now standing in the small interior of the stand. He was no further than 10 feet away from me. I felt a feeling of dread overtake me. The air felt so heavy around me that breathing started to become difficult. Ivan began to close the few feet of space still between us, taking slow, taunting steps in my direction. His knife was gripped firmly in his hand. He spoke softly. "You are my wife." Ivan ultimately managed to take a total of 3 steps toward me before I saw an arm wrap around his neck from behind. I stood there in a state of paralysis due to fear as I watched Jonathan pull him back by the neck with so much force that his feet flew out from under him. Suddenly, they were both on the ground right outside the door, with Jonathan securing him in a headlock. With his mental state, it proved impossible for him to break away. Jonathan yelled strict instructions for Ivan not to move, or he would choke the life out of him. Surprisingly, he remained completely still, never once making any signs of further resistance. Jonathan kicked the knife away from his reach and told me to pick it up and secure it until the cops arrived. It felt like hours before they finally did. It took 6 officers to force Ivan into the cruiser. The whole time he kept shouting that God had sent him and he had simply come to collect what was his. This story was told to me secondhand by my cousin. He's a person who has zero interest in fiction and no creativity whatsoever, so I trust him when he told me this actually happened to him. It was back in 2005, during a camping trip. He and 4 of his friends were illegally camping in one of the national parks in the Midwest. They were hiking well off the permitted trail area and decided to camp in a very scenic spot with a great view of the surrounding landscape. It had been raining heavily the entire time they were hiking, but instead of lightening up, the storm only continued to get worse and worse. It was an unseasonably bad thunderstorm. The only reason that my cousin and his friends hadn't turned around yet was because it would have been more of a bother to hike all the way back and locate their vehicles than it would have been to just set up camp. They knew that they would most likely get caught if they tried to build a fire, but they did so anyway, as they were now soaking wet. They dug a hole in the dirt and surrounded it with stones and built a small shelter over it using tent poles and a tarp. They built up the fire so unnecessarily large that he really regretted it in retrospect. They could have easily caused a wildfire had it not been for the damp state of the forest around them. Eventually, they had to take down the covering because the flames were climbing too high. They were all moderately drunk and started to make Bigfoot whooping calls out into the night and played a game where they tossed a small stone back and forth through the flames at each other. The person who dropped it first had to forfeit his drink to the one who had thrown the stone. Every time the thunder rumbled, one of them had to crack open one of the cheap beers. The rain was so heavy that their shouts and cursing barely traveled through the trees. Later that night, after the rain had put out the fire and my cousin had fallen asleep, the ground beneath him gave way. 2 of the tents fell down the slope that had now formed. When they hit the bottom of the steep incline, my cousin and his friend thrashed around and cursed as they tried to free themselves from their tents. When they escaped, they found they were waist deep in a bog of mud. They shambled back up the hill soaking wet, covered in mud from the waist down, and woke up the other 3. They gathered their flashlights and went back down to collect their belongings as best they could. After a few minutes of searching through the mud and recovering what was still able to be used, my cousin felt something hard and smooth in the mud. Thinking that it may have been a tent pole, he pulled whatever it was out and was utterly shocked when he realized he was holding a human bone. He tossed it aside in a panic and continued to shuffle around through the mud. After a moment, the tone changed, as each of them had found at least 2 or 3 more bones of varying sizes embedded in the bog. An argument immediately began as to whether or not these were human bones. None of them were educated enough in human anatomy to determine on the spot with any kind of certainty. My cousin tried to calm everyone down, assuring them that they must be animal bones that had been long since discarded, and this was obviously someone's dumping ground or something. Thing is, none of them had found a hoof or an antler or anything that would make it obvious the bones were not human. My cousin then stated that whatever they were, he didn't want to swim around in the mud with them any longer. They hurried to make a climb back up the slope. Then, though, one of the others removed another bone from the mud, only this one had a large metal piece attached to it. It appeared to be one of those metal implants that are surgically placed into someone to help support broken bones. That's when a real fear took hold of the group. They ran back up the steep incline and packed up everything right away. They doused the smoldering firewood completely before they left, and didn't take any of the bones with them. The sun began to rise as they returned to the path. It was decided that they couldn't leave without admitting to what they discovered. They waited at the park station until it opened, and admitted to what they had found immediately. At first, they were met with a casual annoyance and disbelief. They were told to stay put until someone had been out there to confirm the story. After a few hours, the police arrived to question each of them separately. The park service went from annoyed to alarmed. They were transported to the police station and questioned further for hours. They confirmed that what they had found had not just been animal bones. Initially, they threatened my cousin and his friends with jail time, likely just to keep them talking and to scare them into being honest. Then, the park service told them they were going to make them pay some kind of fine for supposed fire damage as well. After a close to 8-hour interrogation session, they were all allowed to leave with their belongings. They never received any sort of follow-up. My cousin was shocked that the incident never got any kind of notable media attention, and later stated to his friends the whole thing had likely been a cover-up. He thought that the park service didn't even want to keep a paper trail on it. My cousin told me that between the 5 of them, they found well over 30 separate bones, and they knew there must have been plenty more still underfoot. I often wonder if my cousin and his friends stumbled upon a mass grave with dozens of bodies that had been uncovered that night by the storm. One night, 3 years ago, I got into a fight with my girlfriend at the time. In a rage, I stormed out of her house, jumped in my truck, and just started driving around. I hopped onto the interstate, and about an hour later, I was in Nashville. I was so pissed off though that I decided to keep driving. I made it my goal to reach Kentucky and turn around that night. I had never been to Kentucky before, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. I reached Kentucky at about 2:30 in the morning, having left my town a little after 12:30. I grabbed a Coke and a biscuit from the first McDonald's I found and started heading back to Alabama. As I was heading back though, I realized I was getting quite low on gas. Right as I was about to get to Nashville, I pulled off Interstate 65 to go down the off-ramp. I hit a light and made a left, hit another light, and there's where things started to get really weird. As I pulled up to this light, I noticed something strange. The only other car on the road was at a dead stop at a green light. Weird, I thought to myself, but hey, it's after 3 a.m. Maybe the person is really tired or something. Once I reached the light, the car started to roll forward and under the overpass for the interstate. Then I saw their brakes light up and their headlights go out as well. They stopped right under the overpass in the middle of the road. My heart was really starting to race. I was sitting in the turn lane waiting for the light to change. The gas station was right past the overpass. It was like whoever in this car was waiting for me to make a move. I was freaking out. I watched the light turn green and then back to red. I was waiting to see if the car would move, but they didn't do anything. When the light switched back to green again, I flicked on my high beams and crept through the intersection, trying to make out the face of whoever was in the vehicle, but I couldn't see them at all. Lo and behold, as soon as I passed them by, their headlights immediately turned on and they started moving in behind me. At this point, I was extremely scared, staring at the headlights in my rear view instead of the road. I made it the couple hundred feet to the gas station. Thankfully, when I pulled into the station, the first thing I noticed was a car parked out front. I parked at the pump, and as I was getting out of my car, I watched the other car roll in behind me. I started to pump the gas. As I was doing so, I watched a man exit that vehicle and start to walk inside. The whole time, from the second his head emerged from the vehicle to the moment he made it inside the store, he was staring right at me with this crazy smile, shaking his head rapidly from left to right. He walked inside and got in line right behind what appeared to be a cop. Now, maybe I watched too many movies, but the whole time he was standing there, I thought he was going to try to kill him or something. Thankfully, he did not do so. Once I had enough gas to get home, I stopped pumping and jumped right back in my car. I double-checked my phone for directions back to the interstate. As I was beginning to leave, that's when I noticed the man immediately leaving his place in line and running out of the store. That's when I panicked. I hit the gas and ran the red light at the overpass. I ran another red light and got back on the interstate. I then went about 85 to 90 miles per hour the whole way home, constantly checking my rear view mirror. It's still one of the creepiest things to ever happen to me, and it really reiterated to me what the detective told all incoming freshmen at college orientation. Nothing good happens after 2 a.m. I'm a journalist, and I remember being told this story by a woman I interviewed for a true crime segment. When this woman was a young girl, say 8 years old or so, she started to come downstairs at night and tell her father there was a man in her closet. Well, of course, her father told her there was no such thing as the boogeyman or monsters or anything like that, and sent her right back to bed. This began to happen more frequently on and off for several weeks though, and finally he got frustrated. He walked her back to the room and said, "Look, I'll show you there's nothing in your closet." Well, when he went to open the door, it opened an inch, and then he felt someone immediately pull it back and slam it shut. It turned out there really was a man living in her closet. It was a pervert who would sneak into the house every night through the window and stare at the girl from the closet while she slept. The dad beat the hell out of him, and the pervert went to prison for many years. I did some research into her story after she told me this as well. It was about 20 years after the initial events happened. It turned out the man had just recently gotten out of jail, and no one knew his whereabouts. I was driving along this road that stretches out over about 100 kilometers. It was about 1 a.m., and I was at the end of the road. It was a very desolate area, with neighbors being kilometers apart from each other. It was a familiar route for me. I drive on it once every few months, just to go anywhere really. Because of how isolated it is, there are no streetlights at all, and you have to rely on only your car headlights to see. On this particular night, I was feeling a little strange. Somehow, something about the route seemed unfamiliar, which was impossible really. It's just one long road with the occasional turnoff. I kept driving along toward the place I'd normally turn around. I came up to this certain point in the road where there was one lone house with their car parked in the driveway. I could see there was someone lingering in the passenger seat. I thought that was quite weird because it was so late at night. As I got closer to this house, they turned the car on and flashed their high beam lights at me. I didn't pay much attention to this. Then, though, I drove past them and looked into my rear view mirror to see what they were up to. They'd pulled out of their driveway onto the road and were now heading the same direction I was. I was a little bit nervous at this point. About 5 minutes up the road, I looked into my rear view mirror again, and the car that had pulled out behind me was gone. I looked to my left and noticed I was near an abandoned convenience store on the side of the road. This was a landmark I remembered driving past plenty of times whenever I would drive up here. I distinctly remember that in front of the store a couple of feet away there was an old phone booth. Both the store and the booth were run down and covered in graffiti. Neither had been used in a very long time. As I got closer, though, I saw there was a dark figure behind the glass of the booth. They were looking right at me, and I could see their eyes in my headlights. As I got even closer, they stepped out of the booth and began moving toward the road I was on. I started to speed up. That's when this really bright light came on behind me, and the person took off toward the back of the store. I looked in my rear view mirror once more and saw the car that had flashed me earlier. It was about 100 meters behind me. It followed me for another kilometer or so, until we reached a turn-off road, where it then made a U-turn and went back the other way. I had to go back the way I'd came once I reached the end. I drove past the phone booth once more, and there didn't seem to be anyone there. Then I reached the house where the car had initially pulled out. It was back in its driveway, with the driver still in the front seat. I have no idea what all that was about or even if those two events were really connected in any way, but it was very unsettling on such a dark and desolate road at night. This happened to me when I was a little kid, but no one was ever found in my basement. It was my first time staying home alone, while my whole family was out at my brother's ball game. I was 13, I think. I was on the phone with a friend of mine, feeling so grown up, when all of a sudden someone beeped on the other line. I told my friend that I'd be right back, and clicked over. Immediately, the creepiest voice I've ever heard whispered into my ear. "Hello, little girl. I'm the man in your basement." Honestly, I laughed it off at first and just hung up on that line, thinking it was a prank call. I was pretty confident at my age that my neighborhood was pretty safe. so I figured someone was just messing with me, knowing that it was my first time home alone. They beeped in again, so I clicked over once more. "Don't hang up on me again." The lights started to flicker, and there was a banging under my feet. Our basement was actually just an area connected to the garage. I heard what sounded like footsteps coming up the garage steps to get into our kitchen. I kept trying to hang up and call the police, but every time I tried, he was still on the phone on the other line. Thankfully, my friend told her parents what was happening, and they ran to the neighbor's house to call the police for me. I sat there petrified with a butcher knife, hiding right next to my front door. It was the only place in the house downstairs that couldn't be seen from a window. Eventually, I clicked over and heard a police dispatcher on the phone saying to stay on the line with her until the police got to my house. Once they arrived, they found no signs of forced entry, though we did have a broken window pane on our outside garage door that had been messed up for months prior. My guess is that that's how the man got inside. The police assumed that I was just a paranoid girl and they were going to leave me home alone again after they cleared the house for intruders. Fortunately, a family friend happened to have been driving by and saw the cops there. They stopped to see if everything was okay and gave me a ride to the school where my brother's ball game was. My parents were skeptical that anything had actually happened, but we did get a security system not much longer after that. And my parents both got cell phones. This was 1994, I think, so cell phones weren't popular yet. After that happened, I swear there was someone stalking me for years. When I got older, I would leave my apartment locked and bolted and come back to find appliances on. I lived in 4 different places and would often get these strange phone calls from someone with a similar voice. Sometimes cars would be randomly parked down the road from where I was living and speed up and slam on the brakes. As I would run inside, I would hear loud bangs outside. I moved out to the country to get away from all this, and nothing has happened since then. I've been in my current house and I am married now, but I still get paranoid all the time whenever I'm home alone. I worked nights at a warehouse. Often, I would drive my motorcycle there because it's fun and saves money on gasoline. I was coming home one night. There was a heavily wooded, bushed area right on the side of the road. I remember pulling up to a stop sign, only to notice some weird guy standing in the bushes. I came to a stop and looked right at him. We made eye contact, and he started walking towards me immediately. I nearly killed my engine as I floored it the hell out of there. I got a mile or so down the road and pulled over. I pulled out my handgun and then called the police as well. I didn't see the man anywhere around me. The police went and checked out the area supposedly, but there was no one there by the time they arrived. It was such a startling moment, seeing a man emerging from the bushes and approaching me on a dark road like that. When I was a teenager in Colorado Springs, we all used to crawl through this small tunnel that was directly under the interstate to get back and forth from our neighborhood without having to jump fences or run across the highway. One drunken night alone, I was on my way home at about 2 or 3 in the morning. I remember emerging from the tunnel only to find myself face to face with this huge Rottweiler staring right at me. I was in shock for a moment and my stomach dropped. I instinctively started yelling at the dog to go home. He just stood there glaring at me. Every move I slowly tried to make to get away, he would bark and show his teeth to me. I started stomping toward him in a dominant manner, yelling at it to go away. He turned and took some steps back, but still proceeded in snarling at me and baring his sharp teeth. I drunkenly started to power walk away. All of a sudden, I heard the dog charging toward me from behind. He was right behind me and right about to pounce on me. I turned around and fell backward. When I looked up, though, he was no longer continuing the attack. Instead, he turned and ran away. I know it might not seem that scary since nothing that bad happened to me, but if that dog had decided to continue with that attack, I imagine I would not be here on this day to tell you this. I don't know if that dog was someone's pet or what, or why he decided to stop attacking me after I fell down. I'll never know exactly why my life was spared that night. I lived in New Mexico for several years before moving to the Midwest. My friend Amy and I would spend many days exploring the remote corners of New Mexico, discovering abandoned ghost towns and enjoying the quiet, desolate beauty of the desert. One afternoon in March of 2010, we were traveling to Albuquerque. Always up for exploring, we took some back roads rather than traveling the more direct highway route. One leg of our journey had us on NM 55. It's a remote, teeny-tiny two-lane highway. We love these types of roads even up until this day. This part of New Mexico is a flat and desolate desert area. You can see for miles, and there's virtually nothing but dirt and rock between towns. Towns can be miles apart as well. We were continuing along this road when we saw a white pickup truck just ahead of us, going in the same direction. All of a sudden, this truck just stopped and went sideways in the middle of the highway, blocking off both lanes. We were about a mile away from him at this point, and as we got closer, we began to feel uneasy. We could see no reason for him to do this. We were the only other vehicle out there, and we began wondering if we should just turn around, rather than come up to him and have to stop. We were about a half mile from him when he pulled over to the opposite side of the highway. His truck was still pointed in the direction we were going, though. We tried to relax a little. Surely this guy was a rancher or something. Maybe he was checking something on his land. As we passed him by, we noticed a few things. One, there was only one person in the truck, a middle-aged guy who never took his eyes off us. And two, he appeared to be talking into a walkie-talkie. A few seconds after we passed him by, he pulled back onto the highway and started following behind us. He never got too close, though. He would always get within a car lengths away, then drop back a little, then speed back up again, always maintaining one car length away. We were getting nervous. We realized how alone we really were. We had seen no other traffic on that road, and we hadn't told anyone about our great idea to take this detour. We checked our cell phones, and neither of us had a signal. Typical for remote New Mexico, but quite scary given our present situation. Amy was driving and speeding up, while I frantically checked the map, hoping to find a road that would have more traffic than this one. There was no other road. We had to travel down this one to get to the next town, which was Mountain Air. Turning around to go back the other way didn't seem like a good option either. After a few minutes, we saw another pickup truck coming towards us. This one was going very slowly, maybe 20 miles per hour if that. This truck was old and beat up, whereas the one behind us was new. Amy had us up to 75 miles per hour, which was not typical for us on these 55-mile highways. We blew past the old pickup. As we passed it by, we saw there was another middle-aged man inside, and he was also talking into a walkie-talkie. After the white pickup passed him, he pulled a U-turn and pulled in behind it. As we watched all of this, we could see the guy in the white pickup truck talking into his walkie-talkie. No doubt these two knew each other, and we were being deliberately followed. For the first and only time in my life, I felt like my life was in danger. They stayed right behind us. We watched out for obstacles in the road. We truly thought that old beat-up truck must have set a trap somewhere and our vehicle would be disabled somehow. We even talked about driving off-road into the fields. We were in an SUV, but this was obviously their territory, and we were afraid of what might happen if we went off-road and got cornered somewhere. We stayed on the highway. By now, the white pickup truck guy was right on top of us. We could see him talking into his walkie-talkie and staying right on our bumper now. The old beat-up truck guy was right on top of him. The three of us sped down the highway. The guy in the white truck inched closer and closer. His maneuvering and edging made it apparent he was trying to bump into us. I watched helplessly as he got within inches of our back bumper. Amy floored it. We were passing 80 miles an hour and edging up to 90. The road was flat and deserted, but any little thing going wrong would have been catastrophic. We absolutely were not going to slow down or stop if we could help it. The white truck pulled into the opposite lane and started to gain speed. The only thing we could think was that he wanted to pass us and get in front of us. If he got in front of us and his buddy was behind us, we would be boxed in and trapped. We both looked frantically at the rocky desert on both sides of us. Our only option was to off-road it. Should we risk it? We could speed through the desert and make it to safety in one piece. As we topped a small incline, we saw a sign that said Salinas Pueblo Missions National Monument. It pointed toward a road on the left. At that moment, a blue pickup truck pulled out of that road and onto the highway in front of us. As we came upon the blue pickup, we saw the plate said U.S. Park Service. We looked at each other and then looked behind us. Both pickup trucks did U-turns immediately and went the opposite way. We followed the blue pickup truck to Mountain Air and then made our way to Albuquerque. I don't know exactly what those guys' intentions were, but they weren't good for sure. There was something seriously wrong out there. I notified the state police, and they said they would keep an eye on things.